Welcome to this explainer. Before the pandemic hit, global travel was this absolute juggernaut, a staggering $9 trillion industry that moved nearly 1.5 billion tourists around the world every single year. I mean, we all love to travel, right? But today, we're going to examine a really fascinating and honestly often hidden tension. On one hand, you've got this beautiful, highly curated facade of global travel. We're talking pristine beaches, luxury resorts, flawless service, the whole shebang. But on the other hand, there are incredibly complex, sometimes pretty dark realities operating right beneath that surface. So let's dive in and uncover what really happens when global tourism intersects with human rights. We all expect our vacations to be this pure, relaxing escape, right? A total break from the everyday grind. But the reality, especially when you listen to the industry's strongest critics, presents a much bleaker picture. We're looking at a massive, modern Western industry that, behind the scenes, continues to generate and rely on deeply inequitable relationships. It turns out that picture-perfect postcard rarely tells the whole story. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the cost of vacation, then move into defining social justice. From there, we'll examine extreme exploitation and inequality before pivoting to look at tourism as a solution and the limits of the market. Finally, we'll wrap up by talking about your role as a tourist. All right, let's jump right into part one, the cost of vacation. When we actually pull back the curtain, we find that a massive chunk of the global tourism industry relies heavily on undocumented and migrant workers. These are individuals who frequently face severe ethical problems and outright exploitation just to keep the whole industry afloat. And we aren't just talking about a few long days here. We're talking about excessive working hours, exceptionally low pay, and incredibly inadequate living conditions. They are literally the invisible engine sustaining this massive machine. They often completely lack basic legal protections, and in some extreme cases even have their passports confiscated while working behind the pristine walls of five-star resorts. Moving on to Section 2, Defining Social Justice. To properly analyze these hidden costs, we need a baseline, right? We can't just throw around a word like fairness in a vacuum. Philosopher John Rawls actually hit the nail on the head back in 1973. He said, "Justice is the first virtue of social institutions. The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining." Simply put, true fairness and fundamental human rights cannot be compromised. They absolutely cannot be traded away just to boost the economic calculus of social interests or to bring in a flood of tourism revenue. Truth and justice are totally uncompromising. Because of that, true justice requires a fundamental shift in the imbalance of power dynamics. Look, when people complain of an injustice, it usually signifies that someone has been exploited to benefit an already privileged group. Fixing that isn't just about throwing a few extra dollars in the tip jar. It requires a real structural shift in how our societies operate to ensure a fair distribution of resources and influence within a community. Which brings us to Section 3, Extreme Exploitation and Inequality. This is where we see a fascinating clash in distributive justice. People disagree completely on what is fair, based entirely on their position in society. Take a millionaire developer instigating new sex tourism developments, for example. Their view of a fair distribution of revenues is going to completely clash with an impoverished worker who is literally forced into that very same industry by poverty. I mean, you don't exactly hear millionaires complaining that it's unfair they have so much money. It's these deep gender and economic inequalities that initiate and maintain these exploitative relationships in the first place. To really grasp the absolute gravity of this exploitation, get this. There is a staggering estimate of 40.3 million people currently enslaved globally. 40.3 million. When power dynamics are violently skewed like that, the tourism industry can unfortunately become a conduit for absolute tragedy, exploiting the most vulnerable populations on Earth. And it gets heavier. According to a 2020 U.S. State Department report, at least 53 countries have reported concerns specifically regarding child sex tourism, with a really significant number of these cases happening in Latin America. It is a horrific violation of human rights, and it's directly facilitated by international travel networks. Now, it's not like the global community is completely ignoring this. We do have initiatives like the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism. It's a major framework aimed at improving labor standards and upholding human rights to foster sustainable travel. And on paper, these rights and codes of practice seem to offer crucial protection for those at risk from inappropriate forms of development. But here's the catch. These codes only work when they're properly enforced. Tragically, a lack of international jurisdiction and local corruption often prevent these vital protections from ever reaching the people who actually need them the most. This leads us to Section 4, Tourism as a Solution. So, despite the overwhelming bleakness we just covered, the narrative actually pivots right here. The really crucial question is, can tourism actually fix this? I know, it sounds completely counterintuitive. Can the very industry that causes such deep disparity somehow become a unique mechanism for promoting social justice among poor and indigenous peoples? Surprisingly, the answer is yes, but only if its mission is fundamentally realigned. Tourism's mission for good can actually redress poverty, empower indigenous peoples, protect ecosystems, and maintain resources for future generations. If we use it correctly, tourism becomes a super reliable source of employment that actively serves the human development interests of local residents. It has this immense potential to mobilize global public concern and generate revenue streams that serve crucial justice imperatives. It can literally transform exploitation into genuine community empowerment. But let's be realistic. In Section 5, the limits of the market. Using tourism as an instrument for social justice comes with some pretty significant structural limitations. At the end of the day, it's still a market. First off, it's driven almost entirely by affluent consumers. Second, it's subject to incredibly shifting tastes. What's a trendy hotspot this year might be completely abandoned next year. Third, it is totally vulnerable to global economic conditions. A sudden recession in the developed world can decimate a small island's economy literally overnight. And fourth, it depends entirely on the policies and stability of the developing world. All of this makes tourism an inherently fragile tool for long-term stable social justice. Finally, let's talk about Section 6, your role as a tourist. This brings the whole thing directly back to you and the immense power you hold every single time you pack your bags. The ultimate takeaway of this explainer is this: the onus of responsibility remains on the tourist. Standards and international conventions, they're just the informational starting point. Even your best intentions as a traveler are prone to corruption if you aren't actively mindful. You've got to take an active interest, not just in reading up on the social effects of your choices, but in how you actually, tangibly engage with local people and places when you visit. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative question. Will your next vacation perpetuate exploitation, or will it promote social justice? Every ticket you book and every single dollar you spend is a vote for how the world operates behind the scenes. Think deeply about it next time you're planning a getaway. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.